I'm reading my essay entitled Dissecting the Body Snatchers to Understand the Ancient Parasite That Wants to Devour Us All, which I published on my Substack August 14th, 2025. You can listen to the previous 3 parts of me reading this essay on previous YouTube videos, and now I'll continue. What did biblical monotheism set out to absorb and destroy? Biblical monotheism seeks to destroy humanity's natural awareness of the very connection of the gods to the cosmos. Cosmos defined both as the universe and also as the ordering principle of the universe. The ancient myths of all cultures associate the gods and goddesses with the stars and constellations and planets and heavenly cycles. This association can be demonstrated over and over with undeniable evidence. This fact all by itself illustrates the principles of cosmotheism. The gods and the cosmos are one, acting in harmonious order. That's a quotation. The gods and the cosmos are one, acting in harmonious order, end quote. That's a quotation from Laurent Guilleneau defining cosmotheism that I also quoted earlier in this same essay in the previous parts that I read. This means that the gods are seen in everything, and that includes within men and women themselves. This is me talking now. This means that the gods are seen in everything, and that includes within men and women themselves. It is a paradigm of profound connection throughout the universe. The Bible erases this understanding. Those who accept its paradigm replace the profound connection with disconnection. One God warring against all others, and the people who accept that paradigm disconnecting from all others, as well as from nature, as well as from the gods, within themselves. But this demand for disconnection is gaslighting. It is an assertion of a situation that does not conform to reality. The gods of the Bible, as Laurent Guilleneau argues in his book From Yahweh to Zion, appears to be a composite of 2 previous gods of the peoples who lived in and around Canaan. El, the god El, and the god Yahweh. El being the name used in the text describing northern tribes of Israel, and Yahweh exclusively in the south tribe of Judah. Other texts describe the gods of other nations, but demote them to the status of angels, or alternately of demons in the New Testament, thus acknowledging divine multiplicity in places and denying it in others. But this paradigm does not give us a good grasp of the universe in which we find ourselves, and instead traps us inside of a false narrative. Gaslighting, which I define briefly here in a parentheses, knowingly lying in order to trap victims inside of false narratives against the evidence of their own senses, in fact, is a tactic used by narcissists. The Bible presents us with a narcissistic God, and its false narratives trap its victims into denying reality and accepting absurdities, the very opposite of the intended purpose of the ancient wisdom given to all cultures and contained in their myths and sacred traditions, which actually help us understand the universe as it really is and our place within its harmony of gods and natural forces and cycles and dimensions. In 2017, I published a blog post entitled, "The Gods Are Real." That article contains this extended discussion, worth quoting at length in order to try and illustrate this point, that the ancient wisdom describes reality in contrast to the narcissistic gaslighting of the biblical paradigms, which have evolved into the narcissistic gaslighting of their modern body snatcher derivations. Here's the extended quotation from my 2017 blog post, "The Gods Are Real." Quote, "As I mentioned in my recent visit to Grimerica during the inaugural edition of Skies over Grimerica, discussing some of the constellations and planets you can see each night in the night sky and their connection to ancient myth, Babylon's Banksters by Dr. Joseph P. Farrell is not at all a dry text about finance and economics, but in fact delves into cutting-edge and indeed suppressed theories of hyperdimensional physics, as well as the evidence that ancient cultures may have possessed a sophisticated understanding of the apparently multidimensional nature of this universe through which we are all traveling. Among the many fascinating pieces of evidence which Dr. Farrell presents, which appear to support the notion that this reality is impacted by other dimensions beyond those admitted by conventional science and physics, is a 1951 paper published by J.H. Nelson of the engineering department at the RCA Communications Company, detailing astonishing correlations between propagation of shortwave radio waves and the positions of the planets within the solar system. As the 1951 paper explains, quote, an examination of shortwave radio propagation conditions over the North Atlantic for a 5-year period and the relative position of the planets in the solar system discloses some very interesting correlations, end quote. Specifically, this is me still reading my blog post. That's just the end of John Nelson's RCA engineer John Nelson's quote. Specifically, author J.H. Nelson discovered, based upon years of graphs, based upon records kept in the duty logs of RCA technicians located in Long Island, New York, that, quote, this is John Nelson, it can be readily seen from these graphs that disturbed conditions show good correlation with planetary configurations. All configurations, however, are not accompanied by disturbed conditions. End quote from John Nelson, continuing with my blog post, quote, specifically, the data indicates that when the planets Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, or Saturn have alignments or groupings at angles of 0 degrees, 90 degrees, 180 degrees, or 270 degrees, disturbances are seen in the shortwave radio propagation on Earth. Nelson sets out the different planetary configurations that were found to create the greatest disturbances in a series of 7 deductions or principles which appear to govern the results observed in the data. He presents several diagrams of planetary positions which corresponded to the historical disturbances in shortwave transmission and reception during the 1940s, some of which are shown in the diagram above. I put it in the blog post. In those diagrams, the sun is shown at the center of the circle, and lines are drawn to represent the relative angles between the planets Mercury, Venus, Earth, Jupiter, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. But why would the relative configurations of the planets have an impact on radio wave activity on Earth, as well as, the article hints, an impact on sunspot activity on the surface of our sun, and thus upon Earth weather and electromagnetic activity? Quote, further investigation is required, end quote, the paper declares. That quote from John Nelson's paper. One would think, me continuing with this extended quotation in my blog post, one would think that such an astonishing phenomenon, observed by engineers at the venerable RCA company and supported by years of carefully recorded observations and data, would have been widely discussed in the decades since it was first brought to light, and that those of us who have taken courses in physics at the college level would certainly have heard of it. One would think that dozens or even hundreds of other papers might have been published on this phenomenon since then, and that the original essay would be easy to find in several places on the World Wide Web in the present time. But if one were to have assumed any of those things, he would be mistaken. In fact, the original paper is rather difficult to locate. Certainly there are several sources which list the title of the article, its author, and its date of publication, but finding the actual text is very difficult. Then I put in a link to the only place I was able to actually find the whole thing. Well, that link now leads you to dead pages, so it's gone. I can't find it anymore. The interested reader is encouraged to examine the full 1951 article following each of those 8 links, I say. And then I say links no longer valid. I can no longer find the original article anywhere online. So, in the time since I published this blog post in 2017 and now 2025, that article has disappeared entirely from the internet as far as I can see. But continuing with my quote, you're especially encouraged to note the 7 rules or deductions regarding the planetary alignments which were observed to create the greatest disturbances on the Earth. Joseph Farrell's suggestion regarding the explanation for this phenomenon is extraordinary and may explain a host of other fascinating evidence from many other fields. Drawing on theories put forward by innovative physicists over the past 100 or so years, and especially it seems upon the theories proposed by mathematical physicist Hartmut Müller, or Muller, Dr. Farrell suggests, if I'm understanding his work correctly, that wave patterns originating in other dimensions may be impinging upon the dimensions that we are able to perceive, which may explain why the planets in our solar system can be seen to be arrayed at specific harmonic intervals, and why, curiously enough, certain biologists whose work Dr. Farrell also discusses in the book have noted that the morphology, or body sizes, of known organisms on Earth appear to group themselves in similarly mathematically predictable intervals, and even why economic and other human activity appears to follow similar harmonic cycles as documented by Edward R. Dewey and Edwin F. Dakin in their 1947 work, Cycles, the Science of Prediction. Dr. Farrell even points out that in one of his earlier books, he cited evidence that the same kinds of harmonic wave-like patterns can be seen in human demographic dispersion over geographic space, quote, in areas favored or shunned by urban populations, end quote, cited on page 111 of Babylon's Banksters by Dr. Farrell. In order to understand the full scope of what Dr. Farrell is arguing, a careful examination of the entire book is highly recommended to the interested reader. But note some of the implications of this paradigm in which the realities of another dimension, or other dimensions, are penetrating into our reality and creating patterns which we can perceive without being able to directly perceive or even completely perceive what is taking place in those other dimensions, which are outside of our normal experience. Citing an excellent analogy offered by the Russian esotericist P.D. Ouspensky, Dewey and Dakin, in their 1947 work, note that a hypothetical being who existed in only two dimensions, like a figure drawn on a piece of paper, could neither look into the third dimension or even accurately imagine it. Quote, for if you have no thickness and cannot even imagine thickness, you can't imagine it. And if a three-dimensional wheel were to intrude into this hypothetical two-dimensional space in which the two-dimensional beings lived, if the paper-thin world had a slot in it in which a vertical three-dimensional wheel was slowly turning, and if that three-dimensional wheel was divided into four sections, each with a different color, Ouspensky says in his analogy, then the two-dimensional beings would only see an infinitely thin line of color as the wheel turned, and the color would change periodically. But they would not be able to comprehend why the line was changing unless they were able to theorize the existence of a third dimension and the existence of this three-dimensional wheel that was intersecting with their two-dimensional space. And this, Dewey and Dakin surmise, might explain why these cycles are manifesting in the data that they compile in their book. And this, Dr. Farrell argues, might help us to understand what is going on with the evidence that the arrangement of the planets, the cycles of the planets, can have very real correlation with seemingly disconnected phenomena on Earth. The planets themselves, he notes, may be, quote, natural resonators, end quote, for the kind of hyperdimensional waves that are intersecting with or interpenetrating with the dimensions of which we are normally conscious or aware. That's on page 113 in Babylon's Banksters. In fact, the planets themselves may be positioned in the solar system at the intervals that we observe them to be because large masses tend to cluster around the nodes of those hyperdimensional waves in the first place, if I'm understanding Dr. Farrell's arguments correctly. See, again, page 113. And thus, the planets themselves are visible indicators of hyperdimensional realities from a plane or a realm beyond the ordinary reality in which we normally operate. What is astonishing about this fact, of course, and Dr. Farrell gets into this angle in his book as well, is that the ancients clearly seem to have understood this fact because the planets, of course, are identified with the gods across the ancient sacred traditions of humanity. And what is more, there are strong correspondences across cultures regarding which gods and goddesses and which characteristics are associated with which planet. It should also be noted that many ancient monuments can be found to have measurements and ratios and spatial patterns which relate to the dimensions of the earth, sun, moon, and planets, and that the avenue at Teotihuacan has been argued, based upon the measurements and proportions discovered by Hugh Harleston and other researchers, to have proportional correspondences to the spacing of the planets in our solar system. Based on the paradigm offered by Joseph Farrell in Babylon's Banksters, it is possible to theorize that this grouping at Teotihuacan may not necessarily indicate a direct imitation of modeling of the solar system in the buildings themselves. Instead, Teotihuacan may have been created by those with an awareness of the other realm or other realms, and the intrusion of those other dimensions into this one may be also responsible for the grouping of the planets at the distances that we find them. Note that the above discussion helps to explain the ancient concept of the harmony of the spheres, discounted by mainstream culture today, mainstream science today. It can also help to understand why ancient cultures believed in forms of divination by the observation of the flights of birds, or the entrails of sheep, or the distribution of tea leaves in the bottom of a cup, or the scattering of yarrow stalks, or of stones cast upon the ground or the floor. Divination was practiced in every ancient and traditional culture around the globe, from Asia to Africa, from Europe to the Americas, from the Pacific Islands to the continent of Australia. But it is strictly prohibited in the Bible paradigm. In fact, it is demonized in the biblical paradigm. The ancient wisdom given to the cultures of the earth incorporated the understanding of the harmony of the spheres moving through the heavens and sought to align human interaction with the actual truths of the universe of which we are a part. It understood the harmonies of the human body itself and the corresponding harmonies of art and architecture. Today, these harmonies are denied. Ugliness is celebrated instead of beauty and harmony, and art and architecture brutalize us instead of uplifting us. I'll continue reading this essay in part 5. You can read the whole thing on my Substack. You can hear the earlier parts on previous YouTube videos. Thanks so much for listening.